Luke Mayville, you are back, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. So good to be back.
So good to have you back.
Yeah.
Listen, you and I met last year, and we were actually talking about the citizen ballot initiative process
Mhm.
because there was a bill that was proposed that would make it more difficult, or you'd have a higher threshold for getting something like that passed. And you agreed to come in. You're somebody who's successfully passed ballot initiatives before. Um, I there's a lot of talk about Medicaid expansion
Mhm.
and what place that has in the state. We're obviously in a very contractionary budget period where people are freaking out about it, and I'm right or wrong, I have no idea. But I've always been told that before Medicaid expansion, which you helped spearhead in the state, there were problems, and I've never really understood that. And the articulation is always like, look, you have a class of people that are essentially the working poor. They make too much money to qualify for like 100% government subsidy healthcare, and they make too little money to really afford the private insurance. I
Mhm.
actually, very fortunately, I'm going to have somebody on soon to talk about the lowest cost healthcare options for 18 to 30 year olds, because these are the
Mhm.
people that are the healthiest. They need the healthcare the least, but
Mhm.
they need catastrophic care, things like
Mhm.
that. Would you please help me understand what was going on in Idaho? What were the problems in Idaho before Medicaid expansion came in and presumably solved some of them?
Well, that's a great question and a good way to frame it, because what we found is that a lot of the debate going on right now is in many ways an echo of the debate that we were seeing when we were back in 2017, 2018, when we were going all around the state talking to people about this Medicaid expansion issue. Um, we had, when we were traveling, to every region of the state, we ended up, developing our case for Medicaid expansion. We really boiled it down to two really simple arguments that we even got down to 5 words, and then you could expand on
Oh,
them. But one of them was simply, the projected at the time, it was 78,000 Idahoans need health care. That was one argument, just people in need, right? But the second one was, goes straight to the heart of the debate that's happening right now, which is that we're already paying for it. We're already paying for it. And we would go all around the state and we would talk to volunteers in local communities who had the task of going out locally and advocating for this proposition to expand Medicaid. And we would prepare them with that. I remember putting up my hand and counting, we're already paying for it. 5 words. Remember that. And then, of course, you could expand on it. But the reality was then, and it is now, that Medicaid expansion as a program actually saves taxpayers money. And the latest projection that's very well documented in analysis is it saves taxpayers about $20 million. It creates, over 9,000 jobs, et cetera. But going back to 2018, the basic argument is that you look across the state and you see that what's happening is we're not covering tens of thousands of people, mostly working people working one or two jobs. We're not covering them. So what happens when they get sick? What happens when they need medical treatment? Well, a lot of times they go to the emergency room. A lot of times they wait until whatever is afflicting them has become much worse. And they end up, um, the it's ultimately property taxpayers who foot the bill through these county-based funds called indigent care, where a hospital gets hit with an emergency bill, the person can't pay that bill, so you've got to turn to local property taxpayers to pay the bill.
because
They're
the hospital has to pay its receptionist, it has to pay the electrical bill, it has to pay physicians. Like, the hospital can tolerate some
Yep.
degree of absorption, but it cannot absorb all of it.
Yes,
Right.
and you could talk to, and I know you have in the past, but talk to people who work with the hospitals, and they'll tell you about all the costs that the hospital actually does have to incur. So it doesn't all go to taxpayers, but a big chunk of it ends up, um, on the backs of local property taxpayers through these indigent care funds, and then another big chunk of it came from state taxes through something called the Catastrophic Healthcare Fund. So
Now, again, the catastrophic healthcare fund appears to me, and I don't know, so you could confirm, appears to be misnamed, right? Because it's not actually healthcare as we like. If I buy healthcare, it means like I have some degree of insurance. This was the catastrophic fund was to be a stopgap and fill in the cost of taking care of somebody when they had left it. Like there was no preventative. It's like they had a toothache and they had to go to the emergency room, and then they had to get like a surgeon because it's not just going to a dentist, and like all of these things skyrocket. Now it's like $20,000, and there's no way this person's walking out paying this bill. Like that's the catastrophic care fund.
Yes, and it's important to highlight that what we had before Medicaid expansion was an extremely inefficient healthcare system, an extremely inefficient way of financing healthcare, and an inefficient way of paying for it with taxpayer dollars. And that word inefficient, I think, gets to the heart of it, because right now in 2026, the main group in the government pushing to repeal Medicaid expansion is what's called the Idaho DOGE, which stands for Department of Government Efficiency. And the whole idea is that it would be efficient, they claim, to do away with Medicaid expansion. I strongly believe they're not accounting for what we had before Medicaid expansion. And the reality is that the Medicaid expansion program is a much more efficient way to cover tens of thousands of people who need that coverage.
If I may ask, you're saying that is the articulation, this is a much better way because there's no way we can get out of caring for them full stop, right?
Yes.
Like there's no option where it's like, hey, we're spending $100 million to care for these, let's say 80 million people or provide or subsidize or help these people get healthcare. Okay. There's actually no way for us to wipe those 80,000 people off the books, because if each of those 80,000 people come to Idaho hospitals, they will be cared for, and that bill will be paid, at least in some degree, by taxpayers. It will be paid to some degree by other healthcare premium carriers, right? Yep. Because you and I, if we have healthcare, our premiums are going to go up because obviously the hospital or whatever has to charge more. They're like, look, I got 2 paying customers and I got 1 freebie, right? I can get a little bit of that freebie covered by the real estate property taxes, but the other portion of that freebie, or at least some of it, I have to actually just increase my prices on the 2 people that are paying, because if I don't, I can't stay in the black, right?
Yeah, You're getting to the heart of the whole question of efficiency. Prior to Medicaid expansion, I mean, the analogy that often gets used and that we talked about back in 2018 is the old analogy of getting your oil changed, right? People, if you're driving around in your truck and you're struggling a little bit with your monthly bills, you might be really annoyed about having to go pay for that oil change. You might think, it'll be fine to skip it. I don't really want to pay for this. But what you're not accounting for is how much you're going to have to pay if your engine shuts down and you have a catastrophic failure in your engine because you refuse to get your oil changed. That's such an accurate analogy for healthcare, because that's exactly what happens when people don't get preventative care. They end up in emergency rooms. It costs far more. Or another important thing that happens that costs all of us is that, someone will be feeling a little bit of back pain or a little bit of some strange pain in their wrist. They don't have insurance. They don't go in to get any kind of early stage coverage. And then all of a sudden it gets chronic and they can't work. So they're out of work for 2 or 3 years. And that was another powerful argument for expanding Medicaid is let's actually get people, let's keep people in the workforce. Let's keep people productive. Let's make sure that people can go get that preventative care so that they can remain as productive as they can be. But that basic analogy of the oil change to avoid a catastrophic failure in your engine is really exactly what happens when people are covered by health insurance. They get that preventative care to avoid the catastrophic, pain later on that comes with a great cost, not just to them, but to all of society. Something that I think you referred to a minute ago is we have a law in this country federally called EMTALA from 1986. It was passed under President Reagan, that says if someone needs emergency health services, they have to be provided. Healthcare providers have to cover it.
What happened? What was happening in 1985? Like, could people just refuse to cover?
I don't have that much knowledge of the state of things prior to that, like nationally, but my understanding is that basic law, that emergency healthcare law, is broadly popular. Hardly anyone wants to do away with it because people generally don't want people to just die outside of hospitals because they can't get emergency care. So it's sort of a basic humanitarian instinct that let's cover people. So you got it. Let's treat people. But it comes at a big cost, because if you're treating people only once the issue has become an emergency, chances are you're paying a lot more.
Okay. I did not know this about EMTALA. I thought this was a thing that was in place for like a long, long time. And I realized 1986 is actually a long time ago, because I'm turning 44 this year. So it's like, oh, it was 40 years ago, right? But okay, so at the inception of EMTALA, where we have a federal obligation to care for these people, we get a certain bill, right? And let's say that bill's $1 billion, whatever it is. It's like, because we're going to take care of these people, it's $1 billion, America, and this is the way it's going to be, because we don't want anyone dying outside an emergency room because they can't pay, and we don't want anybody, literally taking their last breaths trying to figure out if they can get a loan to pay for this healthcare. So we're gonna have this bill. It's going to be $1 billion, fictitious numbers. From that point on, anything states and local governments can do to beat up that $1 billion and get it down, that's a cost savings. So they're like, okay, it's going to be $1 billion. If we could pass something or engage in something so that we actually only outlay $900 million, that's $100 million savings. Like, that's a great idea. Boom, 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 boom. But it seems to me that the real problem comes when you're taking the overt action. It's like the train, right? Where it's like you're at a train switch and you see the train coming, and there are 4 people on the train tracks and they're all going to die, and they can't see that the train's coming. And it's like, well, you could flip that switch, but there's like one person over there. But the
trolley problem.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And what it comes down to is, if we're looking at 4 billion versus 1 billion, everybody wants the 1 billion option. But now you take ownership of the 1 billion cost, because you had to make an overt decision to spend that money. Whereas before, it was just something that was required, and it was just the state of the world, right? Like, that seems to be kind of the problem that we're running into, which is, it's cheaper to have Medicaid expansion. And I like cheaper. I like not spending money. I like not being taxed under, force of threat of imprisonment. Like, look, let's spend as few dollars as possible and do these other things. The problem is, it seems that because we have to make that overt decision, people are like, well, I don't want to make this decision anymore. Like, I don't want to spend the $100 million.
Well, I want to clarify something that's really important. We say people don't want to make this decision. There's a task force of legislators who don't want to make the decision. There's some powerful legislators and some interest groups who don't want to continue Medicaid expansion. But every indication is that it remains very popular with the public. So there's some recent polling by a group called Idaho Supports Medicaid, and I believe you've interviewed some of them before.
I actually don't think
Hillary Matlock, I believe.
Perhaps last year, actually during the session, Hillary does sound familiar.
But they commissioned a poll. You can look at the questions if you're concerned that about the objectivity of the questions and things. You can go look at the polling online. They found that it's now 73% of Idahoans want the program to remain intact. They don't want it repealed, and that's across the board party in terms of party identification. Sure. So 65% of Republicans don't want to see it repealed, and part of that is that there was nothing, there was no point where the public noticed, wow, this program is costing us a lot of money. Because the truth is that it didn't cost the public a lot of money because of all these savings that it generated. So when the local county indigent care costs went down. Property taxpayers saved money. When the catastrophic healthcare program that used to be funded by state taxpayers was replaced by federal dollars, Idaho taxpayers saved money. So there was never a moment where the public felt some kind of pinch from this program. And legislators can point to how now we have, a budget crisis and all these things. But for the first 4 years of the program, we had these massive state surpluses. So it's very difficult to argue that somehow this program created the budget crisis. And it's much easier to make the case, which many of us have pointed out, that let's actually look at what's happened in the last 2 years when the budget crisis developed.
Sure.
There were huge cuts to corporate and individual income tax rates. There was a private school voucher program that was part of it. And then there's this whole issue of conformity to the federal tax
Right.
breaks. So it really had nothing to do, the budget crisis has nothing to do with healthcare. As far as I haven't seen any analysis that would point to Medicaid expansion as a program causing the current budget crisis. Even when people point to Medicaid and the growth in the Medicaid budget, the Department of Health and Welfare just this last summer gave a presentation, and this is the presentation is available online. They found that of all the growth in Medicaid costs, only 3% of it is the Medicaid expansion program. And there's a reason for that. Medicaid expansion, as we've been talking about, unlike traditional Medicaid that existed before Medicaid expansion,
Sure.
Medicaid expansion is covered, 90% of it is covered by federal funds. So if you're not that familiar with the Medicaid expansion program, the best way to think of it is that back in 2018, 61% of Idaho voters decided they wanted to expand Medicaid. And what they basically decided is we want to take a large amount of federal money and bring it back to our state. We Idaho taxpayers, we're also part of the United States. We pay federal taxes. Prior to Medicaid expansion, we pay for that program and then we don't get the benefits. We don't get the money back that we pay in. And a really powerful argument going back to 2018 was that, look, we're paying federal taxes that are going towards the Medicaid expansion program, and that money is just going to other states. Our tax dollars are going to fund Medicaid expansion in other states. Let's actually bring that money back home. Let's bring that federal money back into Idaho because, again, 90% of the program is covered by federal funds. So that was a very persuasive argument for most people.
Yeah. I mean, you know what I don't get? I fail to really understand what the argument is. And I know that sounds really dumb because people are like, what do you mean? We're in a budget crisis and it's $100 million line item, all of these things. But it seems, and it's I don't understand how people could look at this and be like, okay, it's $100 million line item. If we remove it, it's going to cost us $120 million. And I'm cool with that. Yeah. I even, and again, you had the whole philosophical arguments last year about people should be working or whatever. And it's what was so funny about that? It's do you want the $120 million option or do you want the $100 million option? And if you want to add in work requirements to feel better about it or volunteering or going to school, it doesn't matter to me because bottom line is these people are going to have health costs that will be absorbed by the state of Idaho, our tax dollars, in one way or another. Now, again, I understand the concept that a lot of people made. They're listen, if we let more and more people engage in this and they remove themselves from the workforce, it's going to be really bad. Okay, fine. I get that. But at the end of the day, we had this obligation that started in 1986, the $1 billion fictitious number. Anything we can do to beat up that $1 billion and create savings should be done. But then you fall into, as you coined it, the trolley problem, which is do you take ownership of spending that money or do you just say this is the way the world is? And beyond that, it's what are we even talking about? And I keep digging into this more and more because I want to understand really where people are coming from. If it's you're looking at it wrong or this actually is a problem or Maybe it doesn't appear to be a problem right now, Matt, but actually what we think is going to happen, I think somebody even mentioned this last year. They're like, what we actually think is going to happen is, although we get 90% reimbursement right now, so like every $1 we spend, we get 90, we actually think it's going to come more into line with the other Medicaid, and we're only going to get like 65% coverage, which means if we have our $1 billion thing, then we're not going to get 900 million reimbursement. What we're actually going to get is only like, 600 million. And that means Idaho all of a sudden is going to jump to a $400 million price tag for this program. It's like, okay, that would be bad. Mm-hmm. Does anybody have any evidence that we're heading towards that direction? Because I don't want that to happen. So help me understand. It's like,
well, let me address that.
Sure.
Because people made that argument again back in 2018. They said, okay, right now, what you're proposing is 90% will be covered by the federal government, but that could change, and then we'll be left holding the bag. Well, the first point to be made is that in the federal law, the federal Medicaid expansion law, it is firmly part of the law that there's a 90%. It's called a match rate, and not 90% will be covered by federal funds. So it would actually take an act of Congress to change that law. And the second point that's really important.
That would affect the entire country.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Everyone in the country.
Yeah.
So like nobody would be happy with the Congress.
Well, and let me just give you a really important point that we now know this year that we didn't quite know last year. In the lead up to the big mega bill that was passed at the federal level last summer, passed on July 4th, if you remember. In the lead up to that, there was a big negotiation that included, Senator Crapo and a lot of people. Should we lower that 90% rate? Should we bring it down to 80 or 70 or what have you?
Sure.
That proposal was rejected. It was seen as far too politically unpopular. It was seen as, you cannot do that. This Medicaid expansion program around the country is just too popular. People like it too much. If we lower that 90% rate, we'll be dealing with some big political repercussions. And so that was a clear indication that there's strong political reasons that have to do with the popularity of the program. That 90% rate is very unlikely to change. So when people just kind of say, oh, that's going to happen, and they don't show evidence of how that would happen, I think we should all be very skeptical.
If I may ask, and you may not know off the top of your head, what are the income ranges that somebody could have? Because again, we discussed the working poor, right? People that are just, if you're working 2,000 hours a year and you're making $15 an hour, you're making $30,000, right? And that's full-time employment. That's not that much money, right? Like
that's right.
30,000 is pretty minimal, right? How much is too much to the point where somebody can't qualify for Medicaid expansion?
Well, it changes year to year with inflation a little bit, but I believe currently for a single, and it also changes depending on like how large your family is, how many children you have, things like that. But let's say a single person, I believe it's right around $20,000 a year. So even someone who worked full time,
making $10 an hour,
something like that. If you were making $15 to $20 an hour, you'd probably even be above the amount. A typical person covered by Medicaid expansion would be, someone making, maybe closer to $10 an hour, 11, or someone making 15, but for whatever reason, not working full time or working part of the year, losing their job, that kind of thing.
Or has a kid or two or something.
And then a critical thing is that you can become eligible for Medicaid on a month-to-month basis. So maybe you have some type of life crisis where you lose your job or your hours have to get rolled back. You can then benefit from Medicaid expansion if you have some type of healthcare crisis. So, or just some kind of need, some preventative care. So, there are a whole lot of people in different sectors around the state who fall into that. Well, back when we were campaigning for Medicaid expansion, back then the number was about $17,000 a year for a single person. And we would talk about that, and some people would say, that's not very much money at all. Like, who actually makes that? Well, it turned out that about 85,000 people are making that. Yeah. And I just have, I mean, I know we hear sometimes from legislators and things. I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, but there's an assumption that if someone maybe is making that little money, they're just not working enough, they're not working hard enough. That's just not my experience traveling around and hearing about you. Usually it was, sometimes you'd hear from people directly. More often it was someone telling you about their nephew or their neighbor. And there's almost always some life circumstance, maybe someone is working, but also trying to take one or two courses at the community college so that they can, get a better job. And they need that help. They're falling. They don't make nearly enough to afford private health insurance.
Sure.
Their job doesn't provide it. And maybe they're only making $15,000 a year in terms of the income they're bringing in. So there's a question for all of us. Do we, when you look at that person out there, do we want them covered or not? Do we want them to be able to get preventative health care or not? And I think it's an argument that most people believe back in 2018. I have every reason to assume they still believe it, that it's better for all of us if these neighbors of ours, these working people out there, get the coverage they need, especially going back to what we talked about a minute ago, that if they don't get the care they need, we all pay for it. And if we don't set up an efficient system for getting them the care they need, we pay even more. That's why it's the Idaho Doge situation can be really difficult to grapple with because they've described everything in terms of efficiency. And it's just so clear when we go back to 2018, the system we had prior to Medicaid expansion was just a much less efficient system for covering our neighbors, covering our relatives than Medicaid expansion. And that's why it seems so many people still believe Medicaid expansion is the better option for Idaho.
The Doge task force, and again, I've interviewed a bunch of the people on it. Somebody described it, and never about the actual task force. I've interviewed them about different things. Like, I like everybody on it, totally fine. Mm-hmm. The thing that somebody pointed out recently, they're like, it's more of a value expression than an actual task force. I was like, what do you mean? They're like, well, look, think about Annette Tipton with the Hispanic Commission, right? Annette's entire budget is something like, $200,000 or something. Now, mind you, we have roughly, I think it's like 250,000 Hispanic individuals in the state of Idaho. And that population of people has its own unique, like, I'm Mexican, right? Like, you have, as you're starting out first generation, you have your own unique, struggles. And it could be things just like language barriers. It could be things like resources that they don't know exist, and all kinds of things to get, like, my grandfather came over from Mexico, and there were all kinds of things that happened generation upon generation to get the engine of prosperity turning over. And my children, his great-grandchildren, are the mass recipients of that. Like, they have a better life and more security, food security, financial security than any of the generations leading up, right? And that takes time, right? It takes education. It takes extremely hard work. It takes all of these different things. Anyway, and so the Hispanic Commission was made back like in the 80s, I think, to essentially say, like, look, we have this giant population. Another Reagan
era program.
There you go.
I talked to someone in Burley who worked with Ronald Reagan to set it up.
Really?
And I'm drawing a blank on her name now, but major leader in the Hispanic community in Burley, and she talked about how Ronald Reagan was an enthusiastic supporter of everything she was doing. So
yeah, and the idea that I think Annette spends something like $1.14 per person statewide. So you have this a tiny fraction. It's like like a quarter of the cup of your coffee, right? Like it's this tiny little bill that theoretically better capitalizes upon this great population, where it's like, okay, look, they could be doing better. What would they need to be doing better? And could we spend $1 and get 10 out of this in tax and prosperity and things of that nature? But the Doge task force is, of course, being very critical of this, not because the price tag is so astronomical, But because, as people attempted to categorize it, they're like, this is just another DEI initiative. So again, the Doge task force, as it's been described to me, it's like, this is really just a value expression. It's not actually about saving money, because if you're in a $400 million deficit, you don't waste 30 seconds on the $200,000 line item unless you've clocked all the way through the like 100 million, 50 million, 10 million, 1 million. And then you go to the 500,000 line, and then the 400,000, and then the 3, all the way down to the 200. It's like, that's not what they're, or at least to some degree, that's not what they're doing.
And I think that's where there's some real slippage and some real messiness in what they're doing. Because I think they adopted the whole mantle of Doge, and the Idaho version of Doge, because they recognize that a lot of people out there believe in the basic Doge concept. And then, there's obviously a whole lot of controversy of how it played out at the federal level. But if you go back to a year ago when it kind of first got announced, people really like the idea of efficiency. They like the idea of government efficiency. They like the idea of rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. I mean, who doesn't, right? Who doesn't believe that if there's a waste in a program, it should be rooted out? So that then becomes, a term and an idea that's very attractive to organize around. It's a very attractive label, this basic idea of efficiency. But then where the slippage happens and where it starts to get messy is when it becomes, we're not just rooting out inefficiency. We're not just rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. We're rooting out things we don't like ideologically, things that we just don't agree with for some other reason. And I think that's clear in the example you just talked about. I think it's very clear with Medicaid, because there just hasn't been a discussion of whether or not Medicaid expansion is an efficient program for Idaho, which you'd think if it's a task force on government efficiency, that would be the heart of the argument. And instead, we're reverting back to the same old, kind of ideological debate of whether government should be involved in healthcare or not, and all these other things. And it's one really interesting question to me is there's a lot of discussion of how, well, yeah, the people of Idaho voted for this, but they weren't paying attention to this thing or that thing back when they voted for it. You never hear these legislators proposing to put it back on the ballot. Like they could have, they have the power to do that if they wanted to. They could say, they could make an argument that it's not working out the way it was promised.
Right. And the people probably think differently now.
Yeah, the people they could argue that the people were fooled or something, which I don't see the case for that, but they could argue that, and they could take that argument to the public and put it on the ballot. That's never come up. And I don't think it will. And that leads me to think, just based on everything that I've heard, and everything I've seen in the statements from the Idaho Doge Task Force, is that it really is the ideology of these legislators that's behind it. It's a preference where they're not really looking at the efficiency or the inefficiency of the program. They generally don't like the broader concept of Medicaid itself. And it's so important to understand that here in Idaho, that's not where the majority of the population is. We live in a conservative state. We also live in a state, like every state in the country, where, things like Social Security are popular. Medicare is popular, and Medicaid, it turns out, is popular. And I think there's the reasons for that are a lot of the reasons we've been talking about. Is like, we can talk about all the facts and figures and the numbers and the catastrophic fund and all these things. There are thousands and thousands of people across the state who've lived this. They have a relative who's needed health care and has gone without it. They've seen elder relatives depend on Social Security to get by, or Medicare for basic, healthcare needs. So these programs are generally viewed as mostly efficient, and not that people, again, I think probably 90% or more of the population would agree with any good faith effort to make them more efficient, to try to find any waste, fraud, and abuse in them. But that's very different than just calling to dismantle them. I think at the heart of it, the vast majority of people in America and a large majority of people in Idaho like government efficiency. They want their government to be efficient, but they don't want the most important programs in their government to be dismantled. They generally want a government that addresses the basic needs of people, especially in cases where, private charity, private enterprise doesn't necessarily have a track record of meeting those needs. And healthcare seems to be exhibit A of, we have never had a system in the United States or in Idaho of private charity, private enterprise efficiently meeting the healthcare needs of all of our people.
Sure. And as you pointed out earlier, and again, the principle that I keep struggling with, there's no way out of paying one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no option where we don't clock in right around $100 million.
Mm-hmm.
A little more, a little less, but that's just the way this goes. We're going to have the catastrophic healthcare funds for people that don't have healthcare. We're going to have the indigent funds. I can never say that word. We're going to have hospitals that are raising our rates and increasing the cost on our bills to cover people that can't pay. We are going to have these things one way or another. The only question is, which way do you want to pay? Do you want to pay the way that brings in the money, like $900 million in federal dollars, and theoretically costs us less net? Or do you want to pay the other way? And by the way, I don't have a vote. They're not, as you pointed out, they're not sending it back. But just from a fiscal standpoint, I like the way that costs less money, right? And you can add in all the layers of humanitarian concern, which I think are important. But just if I just take it down to bare bones dollars, I like saving money. And if you're telling me I'm going to save $100 million by spending $120 million, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I'm like, yeah, that one to me gets me. And like, yeah, the grandma and yeah, the neighbor and yeah, the kid working hard to get there. Yeah, great. I don't want to spend $20 million more dollars because we saved 100.
Yep. And it really goes back to that basic 5-word argument that we had back in 2018. We're already paying for it. And if we're already paying for it, before Medicaid expansion, we ought to be asking the question, how can we pay for it in the most efficient way possible? How can we pay for it in a way that's best for all of us as taxpayers? And that's in all of the analysis and that I'm aware of, points in the direction that Medicaid expansion saves us $20 million, create, major economic analysis from an economist with University of Idaho this last year found that's creating 9,000 jobs by just, pumping all these federal dollars into communities all over the state. It's creating over 9,000 jobs. And then, of course, it also happens to be, in demand with the people of Idaho. So, over 60% voted for it, and all the polling indicates that they still support it. So,
Luke, listen, man, I really appreciate you coming in. Explain this, because again, it's really complex. Every time I talk about healthcare, my head explodes a little bit more, but it's just super complex. And accounting for all of these little things is important. And again, understanding what was happening beforehand. That for me is one of the big keys, which is, look, I understand you're here, but this is what you could revert back to. Now just pick whichever one you want. Sober-minded analysis. You like an apple or a banana? Just pick whichever one you want and go from there. So again, I appreciate you taking the time. Is there anything you want to hit here at the end?
Well, just thinking back to 2018 and trying to really make it clear for people what motivated a lot of us to be a part of it. There's a story that was going around at the time. I first discovered it in an op-ed. I think this was maybe in 2016 or so, before I even got involved. But reading an op-ed from a doctor in Idaho Falls named Dr. Kenneth Krell, in it told the story of a young woman who worked at a U-Haul center in eastern Idaho, and she ended up dying tragically, not because she had some kind of terminal illness, but simply because she had an asthma attack and she hadn't been able to afford a new inhaler. And it was, and there were, and you can look online. There were stories of it at the time. She was in that Medicaid gap. She was working. She made too much money to qualify for traditional Medicaid, but not enough to afford private insurance. And her job did not give her health coverage. So that was a real, humanitarian tragedy, and that motivated a lot of us. And I don't want that part to be lost either. But then you layer on top of that the program is also saving taxpayers money. This just becomes a very clear-cut issue. And hopefully we get a chance to keep talking about it as things go through the legislature in the coming months.
For sure, man. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate your time. We'll do it again.
All right.